I went to ethical culture for a symposium on humanism across the Atlantic, looking for common ground. This was a Dutch and American symposium on humanism at Ethical Culture on October 6th and 7th, 2019. At this symposium, Dr. Klaeysen, former leader of the New York Society for Ethical Culture, made a presentation on ethical culture called The Non-Theistic and Humanistic Religion of Ethics. In this, she talks about the foundations of ethical culture and the history of its founder, Felix Adler, and his principles that he founded ethical culture on, and also the impact that ethical culture has had over the years on American society. Enjoy this presentation by Dr. Klaeysen.
I am currently one of the clergy leaders here at the New York Society for Ethical Culture. Originally, Joe Schumann, another colleague, was to give a presentation today. Sadly, he had a bad reaction to his knee surgery. Apparently, the surgery itself went quite well, but he did not have a very good reaction to the medication, so he's been under the weather. So he called me last week and said he wouldn't be able to make it. So, you have moi. So what I'm going to do is to read to you a chapter. My chapter is chapter 11 in a book that Massimo Pigliucci is putting out. Some of you may be familiar with him. I don't know that he necessarily identifies as a humanist. He certainly identifies as a Stoic. And he gives a class here at the New York Society on Stoicism, which we very, very much appreciate from him. So he approached different people on a book called How Does One Live a Good Life? And I was very gratified when he approached me to write a chapter on ethical culture. So that is what I will be reading to you today. So here we go. Ethical culture. Religion is very personal. Philosophy can be too, of course, especially if one is passionate about ideas and lives one's life according to philosophical precepts. But there's something about religion and the way it's practiced in the United States that is emotional. Some may say irrational and potentially dangerous. Tragic examples abound. Some parents withhold life-saving medical treatment from their children for religious reasons. Too often, members of the LGBT community are not only excluded, but also targeted by religious congregations. A transgender friend of mine has been formally shunned by her Hasidic community. And it is not unusual today to hear a politician proclaim loyalty to God and church above the state, leaving his constituents to wonder how he will represent them if they don't share his faith. What I appreciate about ethical culture as a religion is how reasonable it is and how it makes ethics come alive for me. No creation myth or narrative about a God-made man and life after death is involved. Just a common sense recognition that we are one with the natural world and what we do with our lives matters. Perhaps that is why our membership remains so low. There's nothing especially mystical about ethics, although one could argue for its transcendence. I suspect that many people resonate with our message but are non-joiners, leading good lives without the need for intentional ethical community. I need community. I am the product of a mixed marriage. My mother was Irish Catholic, my father Dutch Reformed. In our rural village of Palmyra, New York, incidentally the birthplace of Mormonism, Joseph Smith Farm, right down the road from my house on Stafford Road, where everyone was expected to belong to a church, this was no small matter. To keep his family together on Sunday mornings, my father converted to Catholicism, for which he was never forgiven by his Dutch parents. After all, it was a Catholic Spain that once conquered the Protestant Netherlands. Such is the power of historical memory and traditional religious affiliation. My children are also products of a mixed marriage. I was raised Catholic and my husband Jewish. Neither of us converted. Instead, we found our way to the Brooklyn Society for Ethical Culture, where we were married and raised our 2 children. It was hardly a compromise, though, since we had both abandoned the religious faiths of our families. College and travel can do that sometimes. Cognitive dissonance can lead to epiphany. That seems also to have been the experience of Felix Adler, who founded Ethical Culture in 1876 at the age of 24, but more about him later. I was initially drawn to ethical culture, a non-theistic religion of ethics, not unlike Buddhism, because in the course of my research, I found nothing with which to disagree, as I had with other religions. It places deed above creed, and there is no catechism of beliefs to memorize. Emphasis is placed squarely on ethical experience. It starts with a deeply personal decision to attribute worth and dignity to every human being, distinguishing these from one's value to others, which is subjective and must be earned. We judge others and are, in turn, judged by our physical appearance, family, and social connections, and the ways in which we do or don't make a living. Too often, the question of, what can you do for me, must be satisfactorily answered before any connection is made. What a different experience it can be to suspend judgment and simply behold the humanity in others, looking for and offering acceptance, even joining a community that seeks to make the world a kinder place for everyone. Most important to me as a young mother was founder Felix Adler's admonition that, quote, "We should teach our children nothing which they shall ever need to unlearn. We should strive to transmit to them the best possessions, the truest thought, the noblest sentiments of the age in which we live," close quote. There was much that I had to unlearn when I left home. I was a first-generation university student and traveled widely. Now that I was making a home for my children, I needed guidance. In their baby welcoming ceremonies at the Brooklyn Society, which their grandparents attended, and I appreciated that, given that they were neither baptized nor did my son have a bris. He was, however, circumcised. I just add that as an anecdote, although it wasn't necessary, and I had that conversation with my husband. Ultimately, he said, "I want my son to look like me." It's very personal. Adler's words united all of us. And I use this in the baby naming ceremonies that I officiate. The love of the parent is the warm nest for the fledgling spirit of the child. To be at home in this strange world, the young being, with no claim as yet on the score of usefulness to society or of merit of any kind, must find somewhere a place where it is welcomed, without regard to usefulness or merit. And it is the love of the parents that makes the home. And it is his own home that makes the child at home in the world. I think that's so really important for all of us. We all need to belong. And if we're fortunate enough to have loving parents in a functioning family, then we can have a sense of what that home feels like and feel at home in the world. I confess it was really for my children's sake that I joined ethical culture, something along the lines of, it takes a village to raise a child, and I loved all the additional grandparents who supported our family. I attended Sunday morning platform services, taught in the Children's Sunday Assembly, which is also known in some traditions as a Sunday school, and served on the Board of Trustees. I led parenting workshops and hosted potluck dinners. It would be years later before I chose this religion for myself and trained to become clergy. My friend and colleague Randy Best grew up in the Ethical Society of St. Louis, and he told me that founder Felix Adler, who died in 1933, was treated like an eccentric old uncle there, rattling around in the attic. Members scoffed at his arcane idealist philosophy with its ethical manifold and winced at the misogyny that relegated women to the ladies' auxiliary. Worthy moral teachers of children, but unworthy of becoming full members. Neither did Adler originally support women's suffrage. It wasn't until 1903, bear in mind, ethical culture founded in 1876, it wasn't until 1903 that the first woman, Anna Garland Spencer, already a Unitarian minister, was hired as associate leader here at the New York Society for Ethical Culture. Again, and parenthetically, she would later, together with another associate leader at the Chicago Ethical Society, Jane Addams of Hull House fame, found the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. Full leaders considered clergy were all white men. Alas, it wasn't until 1960 that Barbara Raines was accepted into full leadership. Such is a founder's influence and the power of tradition. We women have since made up for lost time, outnumbering our male colleagues, as has happened in many professions today. And yet there is something in Felix Adler's words that inspires me. A few years ago, I compiled some passages from his Sunday platform addresses for a guided meditation. It was in response to members here asking for a humanist spirituality. We're very intellectual, they said. We're all about the head. Where's the heart? And so I went back to the founder and found some quotations that I incorporated into these guided meditations. In the introduction to this collection, I included this quotation of his from Reconstruction of the Spiritual Ideal, which he wrote in 1923. Quote, the essential spiritual nature of man is not atomistic, but social. In his inmost self, man is related to other selves in such fashion that he lives in them and they in him. Adler valued what he called our, quote, precious faculty of the imagination, close quote, to envision a society transformed by, quote, creative energy unbound in every human breast, life that is mutual life, enhancing other life, close quote. Every meditation in my collection has a different theme, nature, water, light, and fire, based on images used by Adler. This practice, which also includes deep breathing and the relaxing of muscles, does not stay with one's individual experience. It connects every participant by imagining rays of light or streams of water carrying goodness around the circle. In other words, it's social, not atomistic. At the closing, the facilitator of this guided meditation says, when you are ready, open your eyes, slowly look around the circle, remember the light that radiated from you reaching out to everyone else. Remember their rays coming back to you. Feel the gift that you are to yourself and to everyone in the circle. Feel the gift that they are to you. As Adler wrote, the spiritual nature, the best in each person, does not need to be saved, it needs to be recognized. Recognized, not saved. Other religions promise salvation and eternal life after death. See Jesus in your neighbor, Christianity tells us, and act accordingly. I choose to see my neighbor without any intermediary. Skip the middleman and get to work forging ethical relationships directly. That is what Felix Adler taught. At monthly newcomer receptions for people exploring membership here at the New York Society, I often tell a story about a young Felix who learns ethics from his parents and is sent back to Germany, where he was born in 1851. The family came here in 1856 so that his father could take over leadership of Temple Emmanuel. So he was sent back to pursue his rabbinical studies so that he could eventually take his father's place, Samuel, on that bema. And that was the first Reformed Jewish congregation here in New York, founded in 1845. While abroad, he witnesses chaotic political and social events, disapproves of his fellow students' licentious behavior, and writes home about his experiences like a dutiful son. Most important for ethical culture was Adler's nascent study of philosophy, which he took up after being exposed to a literary criticism of Hebrew texts that contradicted the mythology of Moses receiving stone tablets from God. Like the New England transcendentalists of the 19th century, he was drawn to German philosopher Immanuel Kant's categorical imperative. Neo-Kantians, who posited that God's existence would never be proven and that morality could be developed independent of theology, caused him to reevaluate his own personal theology. This is the cognitive dissonance that I imagine he experienced, much as I did at his age when I studied world religions. We both became aware that our learned worldview was very narrow. Adler returned home to give his first and last sermon in 1873 at Temple Emmanuel. He called it Judaism of the Future, a manifesto of Judaism as a secular religion for all of humanity. The trustees were impressed by his brilliance, but did not offer him the position of rabbi. Instead, they endowed a non-residency professorship of Hebrew and Oriental literature at Cornell University for him. His lectures there, tying ethics to contemporary issues, were popular and were reported in the local press, resulting in his once again being called before a board of trustees. He was accused of atheism and relieved of his position. And that brings us to the founding of ethical culture on May 15, 1876, in Standard Hall here in New York City. Adler returned to the religious ideas he had introduced earlier and more fully developed them, creating a religion of ethics undivided by theology or ritual. He was fulfilling a hope that the transcendental essayist and poet Ralph Waldo Emerson, whom he admired and met in 1875, had expressed for a, quote, church of ethics, close quote. And also anecdotally, Adler admired Emerson so much and felt that he was fulfilling that thought of a church for ethics, he named his son Waldo after Emerson. In his founding address, Adler writes, "Believe or disbelieve as ye list, we shall at all times respect every honest conviction, but be one with us where there is nothing to divide, in action. Diversity in the creed, unanimity in the deed. That is that practical religion from which none dissents. This is that platform broad enough and solid enough to receive the worshiper and the infidel. This is that common ground where we may all grasp hands as brothers, united in mankind's common cause." So the principles of ethical culture that Adler outlined that day were simple and revolutionary for his time, and they are still pertinent today. And here are some of them. First of all, the belief that morality is independent of theology. And we've heard that over the last couple of days. The affirmation that new moral problems have arisen in modern industrial society that have not been adequately dealt with the world's religions. The duty to engage in philanthropy in the advancement of morality. The belief that self-reform should go hand in hand with social reform. The establishment of republican rather than monarchical governance of ethical societies, we are very democratic, and the agreement that educating the young is the most important aim. We societies have Ethics for Children's program. Those societies that don't have them, I worry very much. They must offer education for our children. Again, as a parent, his closing words to that founding address resonate with me. Quote, "We are aiding in laying the foundations of a mighty edifice, whose completion shall not be seen in our day, no, nor in centuries upon centuries after us. But happy are we indeed if we can contribute the least towards so high a consummation. The time calls for action. Up then, and let us do our part faithfully and well. And oh, friends, our children's children will hold our memories dearer for the work which we begin this hour." So he ends his founding address that way, and he says, okay, we've got work to do. Here are your marching orders. To have a religion of ethics means that behavior, not belief, is most important. The theologian Paul Tillich once defined religion as, quote, "one's ultimate concern," close quote. And so ethics is my religion. When I was a child, I was taught that Catholicism was my religion and that it was the best one on earth. No one who wasn't a Catholic would make it past the pearly gates of heaven, and that's what I told a friend in the 3rd grade. "You're a very nice person, Sherry, and I like you. So I'm sorry that you won't go to heaven because you're a Protestant." It was belief that was most important. Holy Trinity, original sin, Immaculate Conception, etc. I could recite the Apostles' Creed at Mass every Sunday and still make a friend cry because my religion emphasized belief. Rather than a confirmation into a belief, my children participated in a coming-of-age program that included field trips to other faith meeting houses and community service. I processed with my friends up to the altar at St. Anne's Church in a white dress and veil to receive a priest's blessing. My children stood at the lectern of the Brooklyn Society for Ethical Culture to address its members on their ethical growth and development. Under Adler's leadership, the first generation of ethical culture members sprang into action with projects that included a district nursing service, hygienic tenement house building company. He was the founding chair of the National Child Labor Committee, which hired in 1904 his student, Louis Hine, to document in a series of photographs the horrendous conditions under which children worked in fields, mines, factories, and on city streets. He also served on the Civil Liberties Bureau, which later became the American Civil Liberties Union, and on the first executive board of the National Urban League. Other leaders and members were responsible for co-founding the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People and the Legal Aid Society, among many other organizations. Hudson Guild, a settlement house in Chelsea, was founded in 1897 by ethical culture leader John Lovejoy Elliott. And I already mentioned his colleague, Jane Addams, who had already founded Hull House in Chicago in 1889. And that was the year when Elliott first heard about Dr. Felix Adler when he was speaking at Cornell and inspired him to join ethical culture. Hudson Guild brought together a number of clubs and programs for children, working women, and families that Elliott had established, since moving to Chelsea 2 years earlier, and provide a platform for residents to organize to improve their neighborhood. The Guild opened the first free kindergarten in New York City in 1897, started the first summer play school in the city in 1917, and opened dental, prenatal, and well-baby clinics in 1919 to 21. It also lobbied for the New York State Tenement House Act of 1901 and the approval of low-cost city-funded housing in 1938. The Guild remains active and has expanded its programs across the city. I love to visit there. And every year I attend the John Lovejoy Elliott Dinner, honoring neighborhood activists, young and old. In 2018, the board president read one of my favorite quotes from John Lovejoy Elliott. Quote, "Just a word about neighbors. There is, of course, no such thing possible as a neighbor standing alone. It takes at least two to have any give and take. It really takes more than two. Being a good neighbor is a great thing in our lives, something that is absolutely fundamental." What then makes up neighborliness? It's a mutuality, reciprocal relations between people, and not only just from one to the other, but mutuality in all essential ways of living. That, I believe, is the deepest thing in our lives, close quote. Perhaps most well known of Adler's projects in New York City was the Working Man's School that later became the Ethical Culture School and expanded the campus in Riverdale called Fieldston, and just on the other side of that door, that school building was built first, and then ours was built. Although the two institutions formally separated in 1995, our buildings share a heating and cooling system. When I take students on a tour of our women's homeless shelter, I tell them we share one beating heart. The message of deed above creed that Adler heralded in 1876 is stenciled above the doorway in the lobby of our meeting house to remind us of our commitment to social justice. Also in our lobby, hang a poster with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and a photograph of Eleanor Roosevelt reading this document. One of our members, Rose Walker, a matriarch of the Brooklyn Society for Ethical Culture who lived to the age of 104, often remarked that if ethical culture were to claim a sacred text, it would be this document, right? The Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Time and again, we return to it for both inspiration and aspiration. Mrs. Roosevelt was a longtime friend of the New York Society, and she supported the Encampment for Citizenship, founded in 1946 by ethical culture leader Algernon Black, to provide young adults from different religious, racial, and social backgrounds the opportunity to, quote, to learn, quote, the principles and techniques of citizenship through lived experience, close quote. His notion was that if the victors of World War II claimed to have made the world safe for democracy, then a younger generation should know what true participatory democracy is. He was inspired by the Civilian Conservation Corps and the American Friends Service Committee, but he wanted his program to reflect the real diversity of the United States and to teach young people critical thinking skills, social activism, and leadership skills. Algernon Black and Mrs. Roosevelt were especially concerned about stereotypes and hoped that by living together for 6 weeks, and it was originally 6 weeks during the summer, and campers would find the courage to break free of them. For the first 20 years, the encampment met at the Fieldston campus in Riverdale, and then after that, it was originally for college students, and then later it was high school students, and it met in locations across the country. For a time, it lacked the funding, but it is now active again. Mrs. Roosevelt often hosted discussions, workshops, and what she called weenie roasts at her Hyde Park estate. When the program was attacked by McCarthyism in the early 1950s, she defended it vigorously. And this is a quote from Eleanor Roosevelt. "The reason I think these encampments are so important is that they are attended by citizens of different races and groups. They prepare people for thinking in terms of all people and not in terms of a selected few. Not only we in the US, but people all over the world need young people trained to be good citizens with an ability to think with an open mind." The encampment continued through the 1990s, and among its alumni are civil rights activist and Congresswoman Eleanor Holmes Norton, the co-founder of the Innocence Project, that's using the DNA, Peter Neufeld, Manhattan Borough President Gail Brewer, and Fortune Society founder David Rothenberg. There are many more. After a 16-year hiatus, the encampment was relaunched in 2013 with a 2-week pilot program in Richmond, Virginia, where the archives are housed. And then it then went on to Chicago. Alumni can now access information and contribute their photos, letters, and journals. They financially supported a 3-week program the following summer in Chicago that included the first intergenerational weekend, both a reunion for alumni and an opportunity for them to mentor new encampers. No longer would participants return home without a support network. They could maintain contact with their peers and seek advice from alumni. Today, in fact, just July, we are able to provide a 4-week summer experience to teens in several regional intergenerational programs across the country. I serve on the board and co-chair meetings with the president, Ada Deer, an indigenous encamper from 1954 who once led the Bureau of Indian Affairs. My friendship with her and the memory of having learned about the Haudenosaunee, whom the French called Iroquois, they're in western New York, by the French for their oratory skill, because I grew up in the land of the Seneca, led me to reach out to the American Indian Community House in Lower Manhattan. The American Indian Community House serves 100,000 indigenous people living in New York. It's one of several partnerships that the New York Society has made in recent years to fulfill our social justice mission. Some other partnerships include 350 NYC, Amnesty International, Radical Age Movement, the League of Women Voters, and Black Psychiatrists of Greater New York. We host social gatherings, and their members have given presentations, including a Sunday platform called Decolonizing New York City. At an American Ethical Union assembly in Albuquerque that focused on environmentalism, the American Indian Community House arranged for us to engage with members of the local Laguna Pueblo and Navajo Nation who taught us about their traditions. Our debt to those who lived on and loved this land long before our ancestors settled here is profound. We are aware of our government's genocide of their ancestors and work with them whenever and wherever we can. Social justice kept me connected to my Catholic roots long after I abandoned its theology. I admired the Berrigan brothers, Philip and Daniel, who protested the Vietnam War, the Catholic worker movement founded by Dorothy Day, who served the poor on the Lower East Side, and the worker priests of Latin America. Ethical culture's call to action moves me to participate in coalitions. For example, the Interfaith Assembly on homelessness and affordable housing, National Religious Campaign Against Torture, and New York Immigration Coalition, among others. Having marched in Washington, D.C. in my youth against the war in Vietnam and for the Equal Rights Amendment, I continue to rally and march for every worthy cause, encouraging my family and members to join me. The best Mother's Day gift I ever received was a family trip to D.C. on May 14th, 2000 for the Million Mom March on the Mall for common sense gun laws. This call to action is the logical consequence of putting deed above creed. Adler called ethical culture, quote, a religion of duty, close quote. It is not enough to pay lip service to ethical ideals. One must work to realize them every day. A typical Sunday service should bring what he called light and heat to an ethical issue, not only illuminating what is wrong, but also passionately addressing its solution. Speakers are asked to tell us what we can do to help right the wrongs they bring to our attention. And we share half the collection we take each Sunday with other nonprofit organizations that share our values. Felix Adler died on April 24th, 1933, at the age of 81. Legend has it that he entered a room where the fraternity of leaders was meeting and hesitated. Then he pulled out his pocket watch, looked at it, and said, I think my time may be up. A few days later, he died, and he was buried in a modest grave in Mount Pleasant Cemetery in Hawthorne, New York. In his book, An Ethical Philosophy of Life, 1918, he outlines his development, the development of his idealism from the Hebrew religion to the teachings of Jesus and his critiques of Kant and Emerson. In it, he also develops his unique philosophy of worth and the ideal of the whole. It is at the same time a dense philosophical treatise and an invitation to explore one's own philosophy. After all, the title has the indefinite article "an," not "the." Ethics was Adler's religion, but he expressed it in philosophical, not theological terms. He offers what he calls, quote, "a system of thought and of points of view as to conduct, as these have jointly grown out of personal experience," close quote. The difficulty is in presenting ethics, which cannot be separated from the personal as something objective. But he tries, by positing the ideal of the whole with a concept of human worth at its core. Quote, "Why do men hold themselves and others cheap?" he asks. "We are more than our usefulness. A man is an end per se, possessing the quality of worth which Adler claims belongs to a supreme, a unique energy." That's kind of the transcendental sense of it, right? The supreme, unique energy. Our knowledge of the world in which we live is extremely limited, but we can develop a plan by which to live. Within his ideal of the whole is an ethical manifold of unique individuals with myriad connections, acting to elicit the distinctive characteristics of others. In some ways, he replaces the deity God with a transcendental ideal that holds humanity in an interconnected web and calls upon us to recognize one another in one another. That recognition and attribution of worth leads us to ethical behavior. I mentioned this quote earlier. When I was a leader in training, I overheard one leader say to another, "You have forsaken your father, Felix Adler, for your stepfather, John Dewey." It was an indication of how Dewey's pragmatism had replaced Adler's idealism. Naturalistic humanism was in the ascendancy. In 1963, the National Leaders' Council declared that ethical culture was rooted in humanism. This was little noticed by members who were busy arguing over whether ethical culture was a religion or not. The nuance of being a non-theistic religion of ethics continuing to pose a challenge. But it was an indication that a deity no longer needed to be replaced by an ideal. The study of science had fully revealed our humanity as part of, not separate from, nature. Not only had we evolved and survived over other humanoid species, which we're finding out more about, physically and intellectually, our morality also evolved from early social interactions around the campfire to clans and tribes and nations to a sense of universal ethics. Having moved beyond theology, we needed to access the ways in which philosophy could continue to inform our understanding of ethics in a world that was finally recognizing cultural differences around the globe. I just want to say anecdotally, I'm reading, because I pile up the New Yorker magazines and I eventually get to them. So I'm reading about a new book that's come about Franz Boas's women students, including Margaret Mead's. I'm really looking forward to reading that. But an important part of Franz Boas, an important emphasis of this review, is the notion that the change of definition of culture, that culture is it changes from being refining one's personal personality through the arts and through music and through education, but rather understanding that there are different cultures in the world and have been throughout history, and that it is incumbent upon an ethical, responsible human being to recognize those different cultures. And so that I just thought was incredibly important, and that's what we attempt to do in ethical culture as we were moving from that transcendental idealism to a more naturalistic humanism with a recognition of and appreciation of these cultural differences around the globe. While the philosophy evolved for the leaders of the movement, society members clung to Adler's supreme ethical rule, and I believe rightly so. He expressed it in different ways, but the basic message is act so as to elicit the goodness, also phrased as best, uniqueness, excellence, potential, etc., in others, and thereby in oneself. It requires an empathy that I believe the golden rule, do unto others as you'd have them do unto you, does not. It's dynamic and it's relational. I must engage with others to understand who they are and what they need. I must listen deeply, humbly, lovingly. The golden rule, by comparison, is egocentric and lacks imagination. I recently held the hand of a member who knew she was dying and listened to her. She was worn out by the previous visits of family who kept asking her questions she couldn't answer. And she felt that they were harassing the hospital staff when really nothing more could be done for her. And she knew that, and she was reconciled to that. But her family was not. She understood that they all meant well and were probably anxious for her well-being, but no one listened to her. She felt disrespected and lonely. She said, "I never thought dying would be like this, with pain and nightmares." "It's very hard," I replied. "Yes, it is," she said. During a previous visit, she had discussed her memorial with me. I took notes and I reassured her that everything would be as she wished. There have been many times in my life, and I imagine in yours as well, when a path seems to be revealed and a choice must be made. It can be subtle or strong. I've used the metaphor of the universe throwing pebbles against my window to get my attention. Sometimes it takes a boulder to come crashing through the window pane. It's easy to ignore an invitation to try something new when old routines and doubts prevail, and yet there's something exciting about change, especially when it holds a promise of transformation, become more fully oneself. I had an opportunity in the summer of 1998 when I went to a lay leadership training taught by the American Ethical Union. It was in a setting with wide natural vistas among people whom I came to love, and it awakened in me a longing to grow. It was expansive and inclusive feeling that gained a clarity of thought and intention. It remained in the future to discuss that future as an ethical culture leader with trusted family and friends. September 11th, 2001, and we're coming up on that anniversary, was the first day of my internship here at the New York Society. I learned what it meant to serve a community in turmoil and in pain. We grieved and raged together and tried to make sense of the world that had come crashing down around us. What responsibility did we have, and how could we make things better? Overwhelming doesn't begin to describe that year. First, there was the personal grief of individual lives lost, killed and literally lost, obliterated in the debris. Frantic calls to find loved ones in the chaos of those early days. I met with families for pastoral counseling and officiated at memorials. We held healing circles here at the Society, safe places to share thoughts and feelings, open spaces to hold but not contain the grief and anger. Then there was the rampant patriotism and the attacks upon Muslims that led to a war that most of our members protested. I served other ethical societies as congregational leader and returned to the New York Society in 2008 to face new challenges of an aging membership. I'm also a Humanist Chaplain at New York University, an ethical humanist religious life advisor at Columbia. The different demographics and needs of those communities provide much needed balance in my professional life. While most baby boomers grew up in congregations, Millennial and Gen Z cohorts did not, and are increasingly, as the Pew Forum on Religion and Public Life labeled them, nuns and or SBNR, spiritual but not religious. Many young people distrust faith institutions that they observe behaving hypocritically, especially in terms of social justice. A phenomenon that I often experience on university campuses is the encounter between religious and secular students. "Oh, you're a Christian? And I thought you were so smart." Or, "Oh, you're an atheist? And I thought you were a good person." These stereotypes are harmful and can be addressed with multi-faith programming that includes secular and humanist groups. How well I recall the thrill of meeting students from different faiths, races, and cultures when I was a student. Life in my hometown was homogeneous and boring. If you didn't fit in, it was best to leave. So I did. I discovered people who were different in outward appearances, but with whom I shared a curiosity and wonder about the world. There was more common ground than I had ever imagined, especially in terms of making the world a better place for everyone. Today, on college campuses and in interfaith settings, we use a new and exciting vocabulary of identity, diversity, intersectionality, gender, and sexual orientation. You may know that when you are now in a group on a campus, my name is Klaeysen, and I use the pronouns she, her, and hers. It's de rigueur, because we recognize that there's something going on, and we pay attention to it. In addition to my congregational and campus responsibilities, I have the joy of officiating at life passage ceremonies. Earlier, I mentioned my children's baby naming ceremonies at the Brooklyn Society. Welcoming a baby into the loving arms of parents and guiding parents. I don't call them godparents, I call them guiding parents. Family and friends is exquisite. Mentoring children for coming-of-age ceremonies always feels hopeful, and who doesn't like officiating at a wedding? Most of my couples have come from different faiths, cultures, and races. Some have been different genders, others the same. They all found acceptance and a warm embrace. My role is to facilitate their collective process and elicit their most authentic selves. Strange as it may seem, I feel a special call to officiate at memorials. Survivors are vulnerable and openly share their stories. It is a time to both grieve a loss and celebrate a life. Forgiveness is important. Some wounds are reopened, others are healed. I remind mourners that one service cannot hold the whole weight of their grieving. It is a communal step in a long process, and they can support one another through it. Recently, a member reminded me of something I told him that inspired him to join our community. I said that I can bring my whole self through the doors of our meeting house, leaving nothing behind, knowing that I will be seen for who I am and no one else. I hope that everyone feels that way. I hope that our ethical community can be a spiritual home, not in a supernatural sense, but in the meaningful connections we make with one another that both honor and transcend our individuality. My faith is in the human potential for goodness. This faith is sorely tested because I am by nature, and confirmed by the Myers-Briggs Personality Index, highly judgmental. Choosing to attribute worth and dignity to every individual is an ethical discipline that I practice in a community because I need others to honestly reflect back to me the effects of my behavior. I know my intent, they know the impact. Together we build a learning circle of trust that can encompass all of humanity. The challenges are great, but so are the rewards. It may not be obvious to someone who joins us for a Sunday service or attends a workshop. We offer many programs that are not explicitly ethical in nature, but they are all opportunities to explore some aspect of our humanity, whether in a talk, concert, movie, play, or shared meal. And we are not limited to particular belief or scripture. We find inspiration everywhere. At this year's Intergenerational Winter Festival, I closed the program with a quotation from the Italian theoretical physicist Carlo Rovelli. And I got to say, we love him. He's written a couple of monographs that we have shared with one another and given as gifts. So this is what he wrote. Nature is our home, and in nature we are at home. This strange, multicolored, and astonishing world that we explore, where space is granular, time does not exist, and things are nowhere, is not something that estranges us from our true selves, for this is only what our natural curiosity reveals to us about the place of our dwelling, about the stuff of which we ourselves are made. We are made of the same stardust of which all things are made. And when we are immersed in suffering, or when we are experiencing intense joy, we are being nothing other than we can't help but be a part of our world. The man's a preacher. And this realization, this understanding of what it means to be human, calls us to reach out to one another, not to make use of one another, but to recognize our worth and to celebrate it. Idealistic? Definitely. But it's also pragmatic and humanistic, and it takes time and patience. We can learn how to be better, not perfect, but it takes an intellectual and moral humility that is often not valued. We depend upon one another, not a supernatural deity in a transcendental realm, to make our world a better place for everyone. That's it. So, you got the mic? Any questions?
I just want to say thank you, Anne. That was a splendid demonstration of what humanism in America can and could be.
Thank you.
And I think any of us listening to you must wish that at the moment when we are suffering and seeing the end, you or someone very like you is at hand. What you said about the depth of empathy and the need for that kind of depth seems to me to lie at the very core of ethical life. And I thought you expressed it beautifully. So that's all I want to say.
Thank you. Along those lines, a few years ago, I participated in a symposium called Death Without Deity. And it was very powerful, and people gave their different perspective. I talked specifically about memorial services and that kind of thing, but I was made so aware of the pain of people who are stuck in situations where people are expecting them to believe in God, that they're expecting that. Or they're expecting them to be afraid. Another member here, in fact, the lounge over there is named for her, Moira Whittington. I came in to see her, and she said, "Oh, thank goodness you're here." She said, "I'm so sick and tired of these people." She said, "They keep telling me, oh, don't be afraid, don't be afraid." She says, "I'm not afraid. What's the matter with you people?" She kicked the psychologist out of her room. And so I think I think so we need to have an understanding. Our healthcare professionals, our chaplains, really need to be trained. And they are trained, but some of them kind of forget their training in the midst of praying and proselytizing. That in our dying is when we need to have our values and our beliefs reinforced and not thwarted. Great, thanks. Hey. Okay, good. Okay. So I just didn't. So a couple of announcements. So I want to thank all of our presenters so much. You were just terrific. I really appreciate all of you.